So the work I'll be talking about today is joint with Justin Wolfers, who's a professor at Wharton. And I think John made a good comment about what attracts a lot of us that are economists or psychologists to sports is it does have ideal data to answer questions about human behavior. And so what I'm going to talk about today is what can we learn from the sports setting about racial bias. And what we're going to specifically look at is, do NBA referees display own race bias? And I call it own race bias. That just means, do you treat people of your own group better than you treat people of another group? And this applies to own gender bias, own religion bias, other forms of bias. And this kind of own group bias plays an important role in a lot of settings. You can think about the decisions that judges and police officers make, the decisions that employers make, the decisions that teachers make. And so there's kind of growing evidence of an own group bias in some of these other settings, but there's always these empirical issues because you don't get to have a random assignment of the evaluators to the evaluees. And so that's what drew us to the NBA, is you have a situation in which the referees are, we can't call it random assignment, there's a lot of kind of constraints in terms of how they make the assignments, but from the player's perspective, the racial mix of the referees appears to be practically randomly assigned. And you have a small number of evaluators, you have a small number of players, and they get to interact with one another over and over again. This doesn't happen in the judicial setting. You don't get to have a criminal showing up before the same judge over and over again. So this is a very unique setting. It's also a very unlikely place to find discrimination. These are very well-trained evaluators making decisions in front of large crowds, televised audiences. They receive lots of feedback on how well they're doing. They have someone evaluating them. They're on the court. They go through videos after the game. And David Stern, and I think David Stern is right in saying this, that he says NBA referees are the most ranked, rated, reviewed, statistically analyzed, and mentored group of employees of any company in any place in the world. And I agree with him. That's why this is what makes this a great setting to look at, because if it's happening here, then it's likely happening in other settings where we have much less monitoring. It's also an intriguing context because these referees have to make very quick decisions. And like John said, it's not always clear what the right decision is. There's a lot of subjective evaluation. It's the interpretation of physical content. So this is the data that got me involved. I've been working on some other research using NBA box scores. And at the time I was reading the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, and the two pieces click together. So let me just show you what we have in the data. We know who the player is, and so I can find the player's race. I know how many minutes he played and how many fouls he got. And then at the bottom of the box score, I know who the three referees are. So let me just be clear. I don't know which referees blew the whistle, but I do know who the three referees on the court were in any given game. And so what we did is we grabbed full box score data from 1991 up to 2003. When the New York Times published their article, we updated the results up to 2007. This data is all on our website. Anyone can go and play with it and learn what they want from basketball data. I think it's one of the best collections of basketball data there is right now. And then what we did is we added in the race of all the players. And when I say race, I'm just based on the visual inspection of a typical student. So this is, do you look black or white? So I get asked all the time, is Jason Kidd black or white? Well, I think most of our students said he looked white. So, and then we did the same thing for referees. Referees is a little more challenging because they don't get their own little bio page on the web. The NBA referees used to have a website that had lots of information about the referees, and shortly after our study came out, this website has now disappeared. But and then some of the referees were no longer refereeing, and so we actually called some of the referees up, and there were some referees that were very helpful to us and were able to tell us, okay, this guy's black, this guy's white, and so on. And so this is what we found. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at games in which none of the referees are white. So you have 3 black referees, and we're going to compare this when there's 1 white referee, 2 white referees, and 3 white referees. And then we're going to compare the number of fouls per minute played of the white players and the black players. Now, we don't really have anything to say about whether you should see more fouls for white or black players. It turns out white players do get more fouls because they tend to be a little taller and they're more likely to play center. So they're in the places in the court where they're going to get more fouls. So that's not the comparison we want to do. And so in some sense, what we want to think about is how that difference between white and black players varies as you change the racial mix of the referees. And so what you can see is that when you have the the 3 black referees, you have a difference of 0.08, and then as you move down to 3 white referees, you get a difference of 0.57. And so if you do a diff and diff, what this means is that this own race bias is about 0.2 fouls per 48 minutes played. So the first thing you should understand, this is small. This is a 4% effect. It's still a statistically significant effect because we have so much data to detect something like this. So from the start, I don't know if we should think about this as big or small. We don't have any other context to kind of compare it with, but 4% is what it is. And then what we do is we do the kind of things that economists do. We run a bunch of regressions. The nice thing about the setting is we can control for everything you can imagine. We can include controls for the referees, for the team, for the player, for where they were playing. And so all of this, and so what you see is since the referees are randomly assigned, this number doesn't change much as we move across. It's always about 0.2, this 4% effect. Now, one thing you should understand is that it's possible, I think one of the comments that came up is maybe it's the players that are changing their behavior. So maybe when there's black referees, then a white player is just going to play a little differently. And so to explain this, what you'd have to have happen is you'd have to have, when there's black referees, you'd have to have the white players playing more aggressively. So the question is, how could you test that directly? Well, there's a couple statistics that actually reflect aggressivity, and these would be like steals and blocks. And what you actually find is that steals and blocks go down. Okay? And that's because, and it's likely that the players aren't aware of the racial bias, but they're aware of their foul counts. And so as they get more fouls in the game, they're going to have to play a little less aggressively. It turns out that it affects other margins of the game, like points scored, minutes played. Now, we were in search of a placebo. This is the thing that the referees shouldn't be able to influence. And the surprising thing is, you think about it, the referees actually have influence on almost every statistic of the game. You think your free throw, your field goal percentage shouldn't be affected? It is, because actually, if they don't call a foul and you miss it, then that's going to show up as a missed shot. The one thing they shouldn't be able to affect is your free throw percentage, and this is actually the one statistic that we don't see any change. It's only about a 0.4%, so about 10 times smaller than what we're seeing for fouls. Now, another thing we can do is we could say, well, you know, this is affecting at the player level. Does this affect who wins the game? And so what we can do is we can look at teams that are really white or teams that are really black. So the Utah Jazz, really white team, Pistons, really black team. And then we can say is, okay, what's going to happen to the win percentage as I change the racial mix of the referees? So if you look at that upper left box, this is when you have 3 white referees, that as I move, so on the left is the point margin. So on the very left, this is a really white team. And so what we see is the really white team with 3 white referees, they're going to win on average by 2 points. Okay, now as I get out to the really black team, they're going to lose on average by 2 points. Now it's possible maybe just white players are better at converting their skills into wins, and so the white teams win more often. And so that could happen, but now what shouldn't happen is that as I change the racial mix of the referees, the shape of that line shouldn't change. Now notice as I move to the 2 white referees, it's starting to flatten out a little bit. One white referee is starting to flatten out, and then when I get to 3 black referees, it's flipping the other direction. Okay? So what this means is since the racial mix of the referees is randomly assigned, the assignment of the referees is actually going to influence who wins the game. And again, we can do this as a regression. We can show it affects who wins the game in the point margin. But let me just give you some idea of magnitude. So in the average game, one of the teams has about 15% more playing time by blacks. And this team's going to win 48.6% of the time. Now, if I have all white referees, they're going to win 47.6% of the time. If we have all black referees, they're going to win 51% of the time. So what this means is that I can actually alter the outcome of about 3% of the games that occur just by changing the racial mix of the referees. Now, one policy you could imagine, this isn't a policy we're advocating, but just this is one hypothetical situation. Imagine that the referee pool matches the player pool. So right now, about 20% of the referees are black, 80% of the players are black. If we were to align those, then you'd actually find that this team that usually only wins 48.6% of the time would win about a little over half the time. Okay, now, everyone's always asking us, well, who's the bad guy here? Is it the white referees or is it the black referees? And actually, our identification strategy doesn't allow us to answer that question. And the reason that is we don't have data about what should have been called. Now, maybe, with like some internal NBA data, if they have really accurate measures of which calls should have been made, then you could do that. Baseball is actually a better place to look because you could think about the strike zone and you have some standard of truth. But so what we did is we actually estimated the racial bias of each referee individually. And so the guys on the right, those are referees that tend to favor white players. The guys on the left are the referees that tend to favor black players. And what you should see right away is there's nobody that really sticks out. Okay, so the racial bias we're identifying isn't because there's a few really racially biased referees in the NBA. It's just that the white referees tend to be on the right side of the graph, and the black referees tend to be on the left side of the graph. Okay, so let me provide some additional evidence. So I don't know if that convinced you. So let me use some betting data. Betting's actually a really nice market to look at. It's a very efficient market. It turns out it's a market you shouldn't engage in, and I'll show you why. You're going to lose money. And so, but what we're going to ask is a simple question: is can you use information about the racial mix of the referees and the racial mix of the two teams to make some money betting in the betting market? So this is just to show you that in general, most of these kind of simple betting strategies, you're going to lose money. You're going to lose about 5%. You're going to get a negative 5% return on your money. Okay, now if I were to use this one piece of information, so I'm not going to take into account what the team is, what they've been doing the last week. I'm not going to use any information except one piece of information. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to look at who the referees are and the racial mix of the two teams over the last 10 games. And all my betting strategy is going to be is I'm just going to bet on the team that's more racially similar to the referees. Okay, and so in a game in which the teams differ by 10 percentage points, I can place this bet. I'm going to get a rate of return of about negative 1%. So that's not a good bet. But now in the games where I get the difference is 20 percentage points, which happens pretty often, I'm going to get a 3.7% return on my investment. Now 30 percentage points, I get up to 7%. 40 percentage points, I'm getting up to 18%. This is a one-day rate of return. Okay, I place my bet. I'm going to make an 18% return just on that one game. Okay? So this shouldn't be happening because these betting markets are very efficient. So this just provides further evidence that there's racial biases influencing the outcome of the game. There's also, after our study came out, there was some work by Parsons, Suleiman, Yates, and Hammermish providing some supportive evidence from baseball. Baseball's really nice. You get these lots of pitch counts. And so they find that pitchers get more strikes, give up fewer hits, and more strikeouts, and more wins when the umpire is in the same race. And the nice thing here is that the effect actually goes away when you have a stadium with the quiz technology, which actually is encouraging because what it means is that our racial bias is actually price sensitive. So if I know that there's more monitoring in place, then I can actually suppress my racial bias, and that's what they're finding in baseball. Now, at breakfast this morning, someone asked, well, what was the response to this study? Okay, so this study was on the front page of the New York Times, April 2007, and let me just show you a little bit of feedback that we get. Like as economists, we're used to getting feedback. I send my papers out to people, I get comments, my papers get rejected occasionally, and I get feedback then. Let me just show you some feedback I got. Okay, so LeBron James, it's stupid. P.J. Brown, somebody's got too much time on their hands. Phil Jackson, if you have a conclusive evidence you want to come out with, you can almost make statistics prove what you want to prove. Charles Barkley, this is the stupidest, stupid study I've ever seen. I left out something. He said, these guys are asinine, and I was embarrassed because I had to look up that word. It's just another word for stupid. The thing that bothered me most is that these guys didn't even go to the game. They looked at box scores. Of course, black players get more fouls. 80% of the players are black. As though, we hadn't noticed that in the data. So, just, we did account for the fact that 80% of the players are black. Okay, so, there was lots of others. Like Kiki Vandeweghe said, I took a statistics class in college, and so I know that this study is stupid. And, there's a lot of them. They all kind of wanted to chime in. But the one that, the one that carries the most weight is probably the league's response. So this is David Stern, and this is on NPR. And he said, my major concern about the study is that it's wrong. They dealt from the box score, which doesn't identify which referee made the call. We ran the data and came up with something that said quite starkly that there is no bias amongst NBA officials. Okay? Now, the NBA does have a bit of advantage over us, right? Supposedly, they should have better data than we do. It turns out, at least from our interaction with them, it doesn't appear that they have better. They have one type of data that's better than us, but it doesn't appear that they're archiving their data very well, because when they go to look at their data, they don't actually look back very far. So I'm not exactly sure how the data